Welcome to the Morrison Library. My name is Tom Leonard. I'm the university librarian, and there's no place I'd rather be than this room. And I think some of you have the same view of this room on campus, and we're very pleased that you share our love for it. It's going to be put to excellent use this afternoon. Professor Tyler Stovall has been a member of the Berkeley History Department for more than a decade, and he has been Dean of the Undergraduate Division of the College of Letters and Science for the past 4 years. When I ask a person who works for him for lively adjectives about the Dean, I got efficient and unflappable. Today, he need not plead to those charges. He is instead here to talk with us about his writings. And certain to come up in the discussion is Paris Noir, African Americans in the City of Light, published in 1996. France Since the Second World War, published 6 years later. And most recently, Paris and the Spirit of 1919, Consumer Struggles, Transnationalism, and Revolution. There are many perspectives on this material, but since it's Halloween and we're all dressed sometimes appropriately, I thought I would dwell for just a minute on how we are all haunted by this subject. James Baldwin, a major figure in the Stovall view of Paris, has commanded this room, the Morrison Library. Some of you were reminded of this at the 40th anniversary of the founding of our African American Studies program on campus. That happened 2 years ago, and we, at that time, exhibited the James Baldwin pictures, sitting perhaps where you're sitting now. Since Dean Stovall is in charge of media studies, I know he will find it appropriate, or at least not blame me, for suggesting the way his important work on other Black artists wisps through the stories we follow today. On Thursday evenings, many of you know, you can watch Homeland, a series on cable TV prefaced by the story. What it does is preface the story of Americans today negotiating a global culture with a vignette of Louis Armstrong in Europe in the 1930s. On the NBC program Revolution, and in the acclaimed cable series Breaking Bad, Giancarlo Esposito commands our attention and scares us, I hope, to death. Esposito's mother once sang on the same bill with her fellow African American, Josephine Baker, who smiles at us from the cover of Professor Stovall's first book. There is indeed a lot to write about the enduring cultural encounters that Professor Stovall has studied. And I'm so happy he could join us to speak, to read, and to answer your questions. Tyler, welcome.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you all for coming out for this and skipping the Giants victory parade. They win every other year, so, it's not that big a deal, right? Well, I want to thank all the people that organized this, and I have to confess that when I first got the suggestion from John Levine to do this, I thought there has to be a mistake somewhere. After all, I'm a dean, I'm not, quote, a writer. And it reminded me of several years ago when my book Paris Noir first came out. My next door neighbor had seen the review in the San Francisco Chronicle and leaned across the way and said, "Dr. Stovall, I had no idea you were a writer. I thought you were just a professor." And I said, "Well, thank you very much." But her remark was sort of, in some ways, the way I thought about it as well. I mean, after all, aren't writers the people that sort of sit around in cafes drinking espresso and, other things and basically, committing suicide by the age of 35? In other words, these romantic figures that have very little to do with the dean who's sort of trying to balance budgets and write memos and so on and so forth. And yet I have written, and I've enjoyed writing, somewhat to my surprise, because as a kid there was nothing I hated more than having to write. I thought it was sheer torture and agony, and yet, well, I guess I love pain. What can I say? So it's wonderful to be here as well. I have actually my own anecdote about meeting James Baldwin, who many, many years ago, when I was very young, my mother got him to come visit our house in suburban Columbus, Ohio, and her main memory of him is sitting in our basement talking while I think a cockroach crawled across the floor, stepping on the cockroach and continuing to talk as though nothing had happened. So I'm sure we won't have that issue here in the Morrison room. Let me say a few words about the kind of stuff I've been working on. And I want to talk about and read a bit from my most recent book, Paris in the Spirit of 1919. This was a book that I lived with for quite a long time. Shortly after I finished graduate school, sort of came out of the research I'd done on the Paris suburbs. And more importantly, it came out of my interest in the politics of consumerism and consumer culture. And basically what this book argues, and what a lot of my academic life has been caught up with, is the idea that consumerism is not something that necessarily depoliticizes people, that in fact it has its own political side, often even activist side. In contrast to the view that says people go shopping as a way of not thinking about other important issues, I argue that the very act of shopping, of purchasing, is itself a political act and often does lead to political activism. Paris in the Spirit of 1919 deals with Paris in the year after the First World War, although even that is somewhat up for debate, because at one point I mentioned that it's not quite certain when the First World War actually ends. But it talks about a tremendous rise in consumer activism in that year that at times seemed revolutionary. It seemed to be imitating the waves of revolution sweeping west from revolutionary Petrograd and the Russian Revolution. And it talks about the ways in which Parisians of many different stripes made sense of this time and looked at their own lives with regard to the possibilities inherent in a very, very dramatically changing world order. It also looks at something else, which I thought was really important to emphasize, the fact that Paris was both an intensely local city in 1919. It was also, as the site of the Paris Peace Conference, in effect the capital of the world. So the relationship between local, transnational, and global was writ very large in the city in those years, and in many ways, these struggles set the tone for not just Parisian or even French politics, but ultimately world politics in the 20th century as a whole. So with your leave, I'd like to read from two passages. One that deals with a strike that took place in Paris in 1919 among the city's metal factories, and the role of urban space in that strike, and in particular, the role of a particular Parisian suburb, Saint-Denis, in that strike. A look at the urban geography of the metalworkers' strike also illustrates its revolutionary character. In particular, much like the Paris Commune of 1871, the image of the strike as insurgency reflected not only material demands and insurrectional slogans, but also urban issues. June 1919 was a series of decentralized job actions rather than a unified strike movement. The wildcat character of the strike and the diverse nature of the metals industry in the Department of the Seine, the area around Paris, allowed different interpretations of tactics and goals to flourish during June. As we shall see, the suburbs of Paris in particular emerged as the rampart of radicalism and the symbol of the strikers' demands for a new day. More than any place else, the city of Saint-Denis emerged as the reddest commune in Paris area, symbolizing the revolutionary potential of the movement as a whole. One of the most popular legends about the early history of Paris concerns the life and death of Saint Denis, or Saint-Denis. Bishop of Paris during the 3rd century AD, sent from Italy to convert the heathen Gauls to Christianity, Denis' active and successful proselytizing evidently aroused the anger of the local Druid priests. According to the legend, around the year 250, they captured Denis and executed him on top of the highest hill near Paris, chopping off his head. Denis' saga did not end there, however. The story goes that after his execution, his body stood back up, picking up his severed head, and walked north 2 miles, preaching all the way, until it collapsed once and for all. This is the Halloween portion of this book. The site of the execution was named Mound of the Martyrs, or Montmartre. His final resting place took his name, Saint-Denis, and on the spot where he fell, Christian faithful built a shrine. In the 13th century, the church transformed this shrine into the Basilica of Saint-Denis, down to the present day, the necropolis of the kings and queens of France. In June 1919, the spirit of revolution seemed to replicate the mythical journey of Saint-Denis, leaving Montmartre and Paris in general to resettle in the town that bears his name. During the late 19th century, Montmartre had symbolized everything revolutionary about Parisian life, in both politics and aesthetics. The picturesque neighborhood gave birth not only to Impressionism, but also to the Paris Commune. By the end of World War I, however, the avant-garde, both cultural and political, had moved elsewhere. By 1919, Montparnasse had become the new center of the city's literary and artistic bohemia. Neither did it represent the heart of the revolutionary left the way it had a century earlier. The fact that Georges Clemenceau, who in 1870 had been elected mayor of Montmartre by the Radical Party, was now the conservative president of France, was perhaps the most obvious example of this transition. Nothing better symbolized the new face of Montmartre than the Basilica of Sacré-Cœur. As is well known, legitimist forces planned the new church as an expiation of the sins of the Commune, linking the radical left in France to the heathen priests who had martyred Saint-Denis on the same spot. In spite of ferocious opposition by the local artists and intelligentsia, the new basilica slowly arose during the glory years of fin de siècle Montmartre, a white church looming disapprovingly over a red neighborhood. It was formally consecrated on October 16, 1919, now representing not just the martyrdom of the Commune, but also the nation's suffering during World War I. Sacré-Cœur has since become the ultimate symbol of Montmartre, the centerpiece of numerous faux impressionist paintings and postcards of the area. In this way as well, therefore, it continues to represent the end of the community's revolutionary traditions. One should not make too much of this contrast. Montmartre remained a working-class neighborhood in the early 20th century. Nonetheless, by 1919, the Paris suburbs had become the center of urban marginality and revolutionary politics that Montmartre had once represented. As historians of modern Paris had demonstrated, by the early 20th century, the suburban communities of the Department of the Seine had become the center not just of industry, but also of working-class community in the Paris area. This was all the more true because the most radical factions of the June 1919 strike, those who most consistently called for insurrection and cited the Russian Revolution as a model to emulate, arose in the suburbs. In particular, Saint-Denis became the epicenter of the revolutionary left during the strike. In that community, one of the largest and most industrialized suburbs of Paris, the city's inter-union council, the various strike committees, and the municipality worked together not only to support the strike, but also to give it the most maximalist orientation possible, and to try and impose that orientation upon the movement as a whole. In this sense, as we shall discuss in more detail shortly, it was the Soviet of Saint-Denis was the true heir of the Paris Commune. It was only fitting, perhaps, that in an era when thrones were toppling all across Europe, the specter of revolution in France should manifest itself in the city known as the burial ground of kings. Okay, so I wanted to then shift to another selection. Actually, this is from the conclusion, when I talk about the whole idea of consumer politics. One of the consequences of the end of the 20th century has been attempts by historians to make sense of that era as a whole, to tease out central principles and developments. For many, consumerism has emerged as one of those defining aspects of modernity, even post-modernity. Recently, two leading consumer historians have published major accounts of the history of consumerism in the contemporary era. Both Gary Cross and Victoria de Grazia argue that American-style consumerism was the dominant material and ideological force of the 20th century. Their research is wide-ranging, their arguments fascinating, and in many cases compelling. De Grazia and Cross both ground their work in post-Cold War triumphalist narratives of American power, reading the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the century back into an explanation of the century's history in general. Cross portrays consumerism as the one successful ideology of the modern era, deployed by advocates of ever-increasing plenty and market capitalism to define the essence of what it means to be American. De Grazia sees American consumerism as a successful, quote, irresistible empire, again in comparison with the failure of other modern empires, whose products and moral values have not only conquered but been eagerly embraced by Europeans. Both tend to conceive of consumerism as a belief system directed by business elites with the goal of expanding markets, and both tend to oppose a consumerist embrace of the value of things with an ascetic rejection of materialism. The studies of Cross and de Grazia conclusively establish the essential significance of consumerism in the making of the contemporary world. While both authors are clearly aware of the many different political meanings of the desire for goods, they nonetheless both subscribe to a teleological narrative that privileges market capitalist views of consumerism. Neither, and this is true of much of the historical literature on consumerism, grapples with the relationship between consumer dissatisfaction and radical political change. Yet, as we have seen in the case of Paris in 1919, frustrated consumerism and revolutionary ideas can go hand in hand. It is, for example, a truism of consumer studies that consumerism can subvert radical movements by commodifying them. Examples such as blue jeans or organic foods are legion. However, this is only half of the story. It is also true that cultural and social movements continually find ways of subverting dominant ideologies through the use of consumer goods. To give one example from fairly recent history, during the 1992 urban uprisings that struck Los Angeles and many other American cities in the wake of the beating of Rodney King, the Payless drugstore chain ran ads saying, quote, "Hurry down to Payless before the bargains are all gone," even as looters were pillaging its branches throughout Southern California. Such an analysis complements rather than challenges the studies of Victoria de Grassi and Larry Cross, counterposing resistance and hegemony. I contend that consumer resistance has its own history, one that has elaborated and continues to elaborate alternatives to market capitalism in the American way. As Michel de Certeau has argued, consumerism is less the application of hegemony and more a dialogic process of negotiation between producers, marketeers, and consumers. Moreover, I suggest that no study of consumerism is complete without a consideration of this dimension, which plays a significant role in shaping consumer culture in general. Ultimately, individuals and communities inscribe the goods they desire, buy, and use with many different meanings, often radically different from or even opposed to the ideas inscribed upon them by those who sell them. Okay, I think I will stop there. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Okay. Let's have a seat. Is it on? Yes, it's on.
Are we on?
We're on.
I'm going to trip on this. I'm Steve Tollefson of the College Writing Programs, and it's my honor today to get to grill Tyler. So the book that you've heard most about, Paris Noir, is a wonderful book, and we're going to talk about that. But the other books, too, are really fascinating, and there are several essays tucked in other books here and there that I want to talk about. I was sorry to hear that writing was torture when you were young, and now I worry, is it still torture?
No, it isn't, actually. I don't know when that change ever happened, probably sometime in college, and I should say that it certainly continued in my freshman year of college. At the risk of shocking people that teach writing, my way of writing freshman English papers when my first year in college was to do them all as all-nighters. I would sit up with a pot of coffee, watch the 11 o'clock news, and then after the 11 o'clock news was over, would start writing and finish writing when the sun came up. I won't tell you about the quality of those papers. They haven't been published at all, deservedly so. But at some point, I began dealing with things like, rewriting and drafts and outlines and revolutionary ideas that seemed at first blush to make writing more difficult, but ultimately made it a lot more easier and more enjoyable. So.
You'll be shocked to know that those of us who teach writing actually were freshmen and did all-nighters, you know. But see, the difference now is that our students don't do all-nighters. My students don't even start till 4 a.m. the morning before. So now that I wanted to get that over with right away about the torture. I was afraid that this was going to be an hour of agony for you to talk. But now I'd like you to set the scene for us with your writing. So where are you when you do most of your writing? What do you have around you? What do you need? Talk to us.
Mostly I do most of my writing at home, which I think is true of lots of faculty in the humanities and social sciences. Not on office. The one book I actually wrote in my office was the textbook I wrote, France Since the Second World War. My son had just been born, and so I needed some place to escape to. And writing at home was not an option. So, but other than that, I've pretty much written at home. I have a nice little desk in my home, and it's surrounded with a lot of books. And you can tell when I've been in a writing stint because there are books everywhere. There's books on the floor. I have an easy chair in my office that's now filled with books. I haven't sat in it in years, I don't think. So yeah, just lots of books, and I'm continually going back and forth, flipping between these books, trying to remember ideas and continually thinking, God, I wish I'd worked harder on indexing these ideas before I started doing this, which somehow I never do. And then I write at the computer, which has made life a whole lot easier than when I was in school and writing with pen and paper, because it's, it's very easy to simply write something, and if you don't like it, just erase it or move it or so on and so forth. And I think one of the things that's important for me about writing is that for some reason I've never really suffered that much from writer's block. I mean, there have been times when I haven't liked it, but there's never really major times that I can think of that I just haven't been able to say what I wanted to say. And I think the secret to that has been that I was never convinced that what I was going to write down was all that brilliant anyway, so I just wrote it down. And I figured I'd deal with it later. As opposed to some writers who are like, oh my God, this has to be the most brilliant thing you've ever read. And they're waiting for that first sentence. I never had that problem. I just wrote the first sentence and then worried about how brilliant it was later.
That doesn't sound like a Berkeley faculty member. So do you procrastinate? Do you have music? Do you have to have, everyone has their own. Everyone has a rabbit's foot or something. What are the other things you need?
Well, one of the
noise?
benefits of writing at home is you can take CNN breaks, which, especially in this last year or so, I've been doing a lot of. And then I'll sit down and eat lunch. And then, of course, the ultimate type of procrastination is always email, because there's always something on it, something that needs doing, something that you probably should have dealt with days ago.
So you don't put those things aside. I mean, you don't avoid them. They're
I
there.
I don't put them aside, but there certainly comes a point when, look, either you're going to write or you're not. And in spite of all the other distractions out there, you just have to sit and do it. I generally don't write more than maybe 2 or 3 hours a day. I mean, I find that partly I just don't have the time, but also after that point, I find that I'm not as productive or creative. I'm sort of going through the motions after that amount of time. So it's usually a couple hours, 2, 3 hours max, that I'm actually sitting and writing.
And when you sit to write, do you have a goal? And I don't mean number of words, but today I'm going to iron out this thing, or is it that you just sit down and see where you are?
No, I generally have a goal. It can be either I want to do like 3 or 4 pages today, or else there's a particular issue I'm dealing with I want to get through and work my way through, something like that, or I want to get to the end of the section. So yeah, I usually do have a goal. It doesn't mean I always meet that goal, but at least I usually do have something in mind.
Let's leap back to one of the things you read then, thinking about trying to work something through. The history of Saint-Denis.
Uh-huh.
Listening to that, I found it interesting. I could imagine another historian ignoring the history of the saint completely and telling us the same story, but just we don't need that background. So what prompted you to put that in? I mean, it certainly changes the whole flavor of that piece in a really wonderful way. But
yeah, what prompted me
yourself.
A 20th century historian to go back to the 3rd century AD, for example?
Yeah.
Partly it was a real sense of place in Paris. You're looking at a city that's been a city for over 2,000 years, that you have multiple layers of history in different spots. And what struck me about Montmartre in particular is it has this very, very long history of, as I once said in a lecture, both the sacred and the profane at the same time. There's the Montmartre of dance halls, of impressionism, so on and so forth. And then there's the Montmartre of Sacré-Cœur and religious practice, which literally goes back to the pagan era in Europe. One of the reasons why Saint-Denis was executed was precisely he was standing on a major pagan site and profaning it. Okay, and I thought, okay, well, what's the relationship between this whole history and this modern day history, which occurred to me first of all in the relationship between Sacré-Cœur and the left in Paris in the modern era, because the left hated Sacré-Cœur. In fact, to this day, if you talk to left-wing Parisians, they'll talk about, I never go to Sacré-Cœur, so on and so forth. And you can see that hatred literally inscribed on the map, because whereas the ground itself was bought up by the Catholic Church, the city authorities, the local authorities of Montmartre, controlled the naming of streets, and they named all the streets leading up to the church after victims of the church, martyrs to anti-clericalism, stuff like that. It clearly represents this distinction between religion and secular. It's also political decision, a political division. And I found that very much relevant to the history I was trying to tell about 1919. And the other idea is that Montmartre is in many ways, by 1919, it's like the church has won. And really, that is the story of 20th century Montmartre. If you look at any image of Montmartre, Sacré-Cœur is front and center. And what's the irony is that you have the idea of Impressionist-style paintings of Sacré-Cœur, even though Sacré-Cœur really didn't exist during the Impressionist era. It really wasn't completed until after the Impressionist era was long gone. And yet it's become a symbol of this area in a way that says that, okay, Montmartre is no longer this revolutionary center that it was in the 19th century. Now the revolutionary center has moved outside the city limits.
So a little more about that. So your first book, which was your dissertation, and for those of you who are undergraduates, that's often the case that someone's PhD dissertation will be turned into a book. You wouldn't have used that connection, that image, that reference in that first book. I really see that book as perfectly clear, but it's a younger man's book, and in this you feel free to use this image. I don't know if you can talk about, do you see an evolution in your own writing? I see, as I've
No, I'm
progressed
just as
through all
dumb
your
as I
writing.
always was, Steve. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely, I see your point, because in many ways, after I wrote my dissertation, which a friend of mine once defined a dissertation as a book that nobody reads. After I wrote that and published that as a book, I went into something very different, Paris Noir, a very different kind of history. And this book, Paris 1919, in many ways is going back to very similar territory that I explored with my dissertation. But as you say, there's many ways in which it's very different from that. My dissertation in my first book was very, very archivally driven. It was very much shaped around the history of one Paris suburb, and I tried really not to go beyond those bounds. And I really didn't look to the extent that I did with my third book at the broader implications of this history. One of the arguments I've made in my most recent book is that the division between city and suburb in Paris really replicates and symbolizes the division between different parts of the world that becomes so evident at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. The difference between the infant Soviet Union and the capitalist powers of the West, but also the difference between North and South, between the colonized world and the colonial world. One of the stories of the Paris 1919 Peace Conference is the fact that you have all these representatives of the colonies who come asking for independence, given that this is a war that's basically fought for self-determination of all peoples, and they're almost completely ignored. They are completely ignored. And so those are the kinds of broader sort of affinities that I'm looking at that I didn't look at my first book. So yeah, hopefully I've grown up a little.
Well, and also, and not even just the affinities, but the willingness to stretch for an image that is going to be really appealing to your reader. And I mean, that really made that whole passage come alive for me.
Yeah.
And then I learned some accidental history on the side, which is always good.
Yeah.
I'd like you to read a passage, if you
Sure.
will, from, if you have your copy. This is the back page of your program. This
Let
is
me borrow yours.
this is from a book called Why France. I have it here somewhere. Why France? American historians reflect on an enduring fascination.
Right.
And this is, Tyler has one called An African American in Paris, and this is part of it. So
Yeah,
please.
okay. Well, let me just read this passage and I'll say a bit about it. Paris Noir, African Americans in the City of Light, thus challenged both the segregation of the American historical profession and my own bifurcated existence. In considering the history of Black Americans who moved to Paris during the 20th century, I sought to write a book that would appeal both to French historians and to a broader African American public. As I put it to one audience, a book that would attract readers of both French historical studies and Ebony magazine. This was a tall order indeed, and trying to achieve it meant changing how I thought of and wrote history. I intentionally wrote Paris Noir for a popular audience, abjuring footnotes and historiographical discussions, and choosing not to work with a university press. In contrast to France, most American history professors publish with university presses, whose books are for the most part read by other professors and graduate students. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of points there. First of all, I found myself especially once I finished graduate school, as one of the very few African Americans in the French history profession. Oftentimes I would go to conferences in the profession and be the only person of color in those meetings. So I decided, well, I need to do something to address this, both for my own scholarly interests, but also for more broader sociological and issues of inclusion and justice. And that was part of the reason why I chose to write Paris Noir. Another reason, and this shows how intellectual decisions are often driven by very banal sides of life. I was a bit older. I was married when I wrote Paris Noir. The idea of going off to France for a year was a lot more difficult than it was as a graduate student. And Paris Noir was a book I could use largely based on published sources or sources available in the United States. So that drove it too. But I was also very much intrigued by the idea of challenging boundaries, both within the historical profession and between the historical profession and the broader reading public. Because I think there is a sense, and this sense has often taken hold of the humanities in general, that we judge how sophisticated a work is by how few people can understand it. And if I'm smart enough to say something you can't understand, well, I'm obviously smarter than you are. For me, writing is all about communication, about sharing of ideas. And if you write something that doesn't succeed in doing that, then you really haven't succeeded as a writer. And so that's part of what drove this project. I also wanted something I could take home to my mother and she would read. So, and she did. And she said it was great, by the way.
Has anyone's mother ever said their book wasn't great? I'm just asking. Oh, oh, I'm sorry, Kaya. Yes.
Oh, okay.
I forgot. So there are several things about this. First of all, of course, I'm offended by the fact that you say, but I'll get over it, that it would attract a broader African American public, excluding me. And I think it's such a wonderful book that I really encourage everyone to read. I hadn't read this passage as I was reading your books. Mm-hmm. And the odd thing is that one of my questions was, why doesn't this book have footnotes? Why is it published by General Press? And then you answered all my questions here. But there's got to be more to it than that, than you say here, that it doesn't have footnotes. And there's something different about the style, too, about the overall tone. And I don't know if you can talk about that.
Sure. It's written in a much more narrative style. It's a book that covers much more ground than my other books. I mean, the book I just read from deals with basically the history of one year. My dissertation and first book dealt with the history of one suburb. This is, on the other hand, looking at the whole sweep of the 20th century. And it is, I wrote it in a way to really emphasize trying to bring this history alive. Because what I found was there were bits and pieces of this history that had been discussed a lot, especially with regard to African American writers, and also with regard to main performers like Josephine Baker. But part of my interest as a historian is as a social historian. In other words, uncovering the lives of people that have often been forgotten by posterity and seen as unimportant. And I found all these other people out there whose lives were in many ways equally interesting, but much less well known. So I tried to do that, but I also tried to make this a pretty vivid story, to try and, in my own writing, encapsulate some of the romance that drove so many of these people, while at the same time being somewhat critical of it. And I should say that my own relationship with Paris was, at least at first, anything but romantic. I first went there to live as a graduate student working on my dissertation, and if you're ever in that situation, you probably know that you're in a situation where you figure this 1 year of research is going to shape the entire rest of your life forever. And if you blow it, you're really screwed. So, in fact, going back to James Baldwin, I actually gave up the chance to go drinking with James Baldwin one night because I had to get back to the archives.
I was going to bring that up. You had the nice James Baldwin. Sorry, I was actually going to take a poll of the audience to find how many people think they would have done that. So, little archive work, drinking with James Baldwin. I mean, I know it's a hard decision. So
let me just offer that as an insight into my state of mind.
Did you find it hard to switch styles? This is you don't. Let me start again. You don't write in what I consider in any of your books, such a dense historical style filled with jargon.
Mm-hmm.
You don't do that. But still, this had to be a big change for
Mm-hmm.
you. And can you remember any struggles that you had with the tone and style, or did it seem to come pretty much
Well,
naturally?
I remember one of the things my editor pointed out to me at one point. I was describing all these people, and she said, you should say something about what they look like. And I was like, what they look like? What historian would talk about what people look like? So I had to go back through and sort of figure out, okay, this person was short, this person had dark skin, this person had, intense look, so on and so forth, right? And that kind of thing, I'd never learned that in graduate school, to write in that kind of way, to give that kind of view of people, So things like that, or trying to wrestle with, on the one hand, including a lot of detail, because I was very interested in detail, but trying to keep the detail from overwhelming the story, which was a danger, So yeah, and I think the other thing about this is my second book, and I think, for a lot of historians, for example, somebody once told me, one of my colleagues told me that the number of history professors in the United States who actually write more than one book is only like 6% of all history professors, right? So virtually all of us who do publish a book, basically the book was the book that was our dissertation. We started working on it with a graduate advisor or several professors, and we had this whole long process of turning it into finally a book. The second book, all of a sudden you find yourself unmoored, completely adrift. There is no advisor out there. There is no sort of, structure. It's just on you, And in my case, that felt quite liberating. I finally killed my advisor, right? Actually, he died some years before, so I didn't have to.
Please don't.
Metaphorically, right?
Just wanted to clarify.
But for a lot of people, it can also be a really frightening process, So yeah, I think in some ways the fact that it was my second book made it easier, because I decided, okay, I've done the first book, I've done the thing with the footnotes and with the university press. I've shown I can do that, I got tenure. Now I can do something different.
But there still wasn't the fear of you had tenure, but then there's promotion and, is this book going to count? Is this book going to count in history department? Because I can see in some departments they would say, well, that's nice, but what have you really done lately?
Yeah, of course. I mean, well, put it this way. Had I been more savvy as to the ways of academia, I might have been afraid of that. But I was so grateful just to get tenure and to have a permanent job. That was all I thought about, frankly. It's like, I've got tenure. I don't have to worry. Full professor? What's that? I'll worry about that later.
So was this book fun to write?
It was a lot of fun. One of the comments is from my wife, who's a professor of medical anthropology in the School of Public Health here. And at one point she said, I'm doing real research. You talk to like fashion models and writers and artists and people like that,
Well, you've mentioned her and that, so I want to ask does she read your work as it's being produced or at some point? And do you read her work? And what's going on there in your private lives that we should know about?
We do. I mean, our work is very different. She's much more of a hardcore social scientist, medical anthropology. She doesn't write books. She writes articles, for example. And she's writing in a very different kind of way. Her work is much more statistical and quantitative than mine, which isn't statistical or quantitative at all, practically. But we do read each other's work sometimes, and she always has really interesting things to say about that before she tells me, now it's time to work on dinner or get Justin's clothes together or whatever. So it's nice to have somebody in my life who's both an academic but also a different kind of academic. I've often wondered about people who are married to people that do the exact same thing that they do. I'm wondering if it gets sort of cloying at a certain time. I mean, this is not a criticism of anybody out there, but I'm not sure it would work quite as well for me.
I'm thinking of people on campus. We'll find out.
Yeah, well.
We'll ask. So does anyone read your work in process, or at what stage? And pick any of your books to talk about. At what stage does someone else get to see it for the first time, and who is that person?
Well, I have a circle of friends and former students of mine, students and former students who've read works of mine. And as one of my students, when I said that he pulled no punches on my draft in spite of the fact that I was the advisee, he said, no, it's because I was your advisee that I pulled no punches. So yeah, and I have a community of friends throughout the country. I mean, one of my best friends is now a professor at Wisconsin, where I did my work. She came well after I left there. But she, sat down and read the entire manuscript, and I've done the same for her. So, one of the nice things about the online world we live in, it's easy to zap a manuscript off to somebody and ask them to read it. Now, of course, that has its downsides. I've gotten manuscripts from people I didn't even know asking me to read them. But, it's also very nice. And so I do have a community of people. And then, of course, there's working with the various editors I've had to work with. And I wanted to say something about that because I think as anybody who's published a book knows, by the time the book comes out in print, it's a very different animal from where it started and from where you conceived of it. And you get to the point where at a certain point you sort of lose track of how many different revisions you've gone through, how many different times you revised this or that page or chapter. And there's times in which it somehow doesn't seem like yours anymore. There's times in which you sort of you pick up the book that you've published, and you look at a page and you say, well, I don't really remember writing that, I'm not even sure I understand that. And partly it's because your editor said, well, this makes no sense, you should rewrite it, so on and so forth. But I think especially in history books, because it's such a long process, thankfully we don't have to worry about it being topical or, sort of losing its relevance because it's about people that are long since dead. There's a sense in which you become, I wouldn't say alienated, but removed from it in a way. That can be challenging.
So I have several things. One, but at least it isn't like what we hear about movie scripts, right? Where you say, I want to write this book about the African Americans in Paris, and they say, we love it, let's make it Italians in New Jersey, and we'll go, right?
It would be if there were more money behind it, let's put it that way.
So I can't tell from what you're saying whether it's just distance, or is there a little bit of postpartum depression with this, that when you're done with the book, you've done it so much that it is sort of, it's an alien thing, and it's just...
Well, a little bit, because, when it all comes down to something like this, and I can show you like piles and piles of paper and drafts and so on and so forth that just seem so voluminous, and it comes down to this little thing that you can practically put in your pocket. And it's like, 10 years of work, and that's all there is.
And that's it? You couldn't... I've heard that the thing artists like to hear least from people is, how long did it take you to paint that? And so that's all you could produce?
Yeah, right,
just
right, right.
Done
other things in the meantime, but,
So what do you want from your readers and from your editors? What's the best? Who's the best? What constitutes the best reader, the best editor?
It's like I used to have this standard for grading students, that a student who got an A+ in my class was somebody who could take, you'll probably all be glad you're not in my class right now, but somebody who could take a subject with which I was quite familiar and present ideas about it that had never occurred to me. That, to me, constituted like A+ work, okay? I think for readers, this is not very great, obviously, but I like people that can come up with insights that hadn't necessarily occurred to me about my work. And perhaps take it in a whole another direction, which is enormously stimulating to me. And I think because of that, you get into talking about not just particular books, but how this fits into a sort of longer-term intellectual project and journey, which is only sort of being elaborated in the journeying itself. I didn't start out saying I want to spend my life writing about this or that theme. It's not like the tradition of Japanese painters or Chinese landscape painters, where they have one subject they work on for their entire lives. But nonetheless, after you get to a certain point, you realize you are sort of working in a certain journey, that these things have connections. And from editors, I'd like, first, tolerance of the fact that I'm taking a lot longer to write this book than I told them I would. And tough love. Tough love.
Explain that.
In other words, a belief in the project, but also a willingness not to settle for second best. To emphasize that you have to do the best that you can do, and that we know you're capable of doing.
Does that you were talking about ideas and directions? Does that come down to things like grammar and structure and?
Yeah, well, one of the things that happens, I've done this before with graduate students who are writing papers, and I've taken a piece that I've written and gotten back from a reviewer or an editor, and showed them the acres of red pencil drawings on it and stuff like that, and the very stringent critiques that people give. So sometimes it comes down to that. I've gotten reviews of my work that have started out by saying, this is great, this is wonderful. And then page after page after page, if this sentence makes no sense, so on and so forth, right? And I find that really helpful.
That's what you want.
Yeah, that's what I want. I mean, it's humbling,
Yeah.
but it's also extremely helpful because I know that the thing about a book or anything that you publish, once you publish it, it's out there, and you're responsible for whatever's in there. And if it's not your best work, then that's going to stay with you for a long time.
Well, is there anything that you care to talk about that you wish you could revise? Small pieces, big pieces, or you figure, well,
that's the other thing about a book. As soon as it comes out or an article, you look at things and think, I should have said this. I should have said that. But it's like a friend of mine in graduate school said, there are two types of dissertations in this world: perfect and finished. You can have one or the other, but you can't really have both. And so I think that's always going to be, it's part of just sort of putting yourself out there. There's always things you can think of that, well, I wish I'd done this differently, but oh well.
So you talked about your graduate students. So is that generally, are you treat them as you want to be treated, it sounds like, but they probably don't necessarily want to be treated that way. But is that, you're a good marker?
I am. I mean, I like to think that I'm pretty, I mean, I want to be very supportive with them because I know graduate school is very, very hard row to hoe. But I also want to give them a sense of the kind of reactions they're going to get when they put their work out before a broader public. I mean, part of the strange thing about graduate school is you're doing all this work to write for basically just a few people, the professors on your committee. And then all of a sudden you finish, and then all of a sudden you have to think about, okay, appealing to a much broader audience. And I think one of the things that perhaps faculty need to do a better job of is training students for precisely that transition. That you're not just going to be working towards your dissertation, towards your degree, you're going to be working towards putting your ideas out there and for a much broader public, a hopefully much broader public.
So that comes back to your statement here about Paris Noir and the very end. In contrast to France, most American history professors publish with university presses whose books are for the most part read by other professors and graduate students. Depending on how one reads that can be a terribly depressing statement to make. Yeah. It's sort of like, why bother then, if it's just going to be read by? Mm-hmm. And so, defend yourself.
Well, I think, first of all, let me make the point that there are also lots of historians who are not necessarily university professors who do write for a much broader market, and who, by the way, make a whole lot more money in some cases than the university professors. So David McCullough, for example, whose book on Americans in Paris has been topping the bestseller list for months, is one of those examples. Our own Adam Hochschild, for example, who lives in Berkeley, is another example of a kind of popular historian. There's a tendency among university professors who are historians to look down upon people like that. There's no footnotes, it's not as carefully written. And then there's, of course, there's a whole genre which is important now of presidential historians, right? People like Michael Beschloss who get all coverage on CNN and so on and so forth, and write tome after tome about American presidents. Part of this goes to the whole question of why do you write? And part of it is to be read, but part of it is also to solve problems in your own mind. Okay? And so, in many ways, I feel lucky for the idea that I can write something, and it's driven by my own inner sort of desires to figure a problem out, as much as by the desire to convince somebody else of the rightness of my viewpoint. So I think both are at work, and I think ultimately being a successful, certainly an academic writer, is finding the sweet spot that balances those two.
Good. I'm glad you said that, because otherwise I was thinking, so the university is paying you all this money just so you can sit around and make yourself happy by working out a problem. Right. Okay, so we've got the Red Belt, which is your first book. We've got Paris Noir, France since the Second World War, which is, as you called it, a textbook. So what I love about this is that it's this little thin book, and he covers all that territory. And then you have...
Well, let me say my favorite piece of writing in that book was actually the dedication, because I dedicated it to my son. This was published in 2003? And I dedicated it to my son, who I said, for whom the 20th century is only history, because he was born in 2001.
Right. So We'll just pause there for the touching moment because I wasn't going to follow up on that. Okay, then Paris in the Spirit of 1919, which is about 1 year, as you talked about. And then you have an essay in the catalog for a show for the work of the artist Henry Osawa Tanner, which is sort of an argumentative essay. You're trying to bring back a place that has sort of been robbed from his place as an African American in Paris. So what I want is sort of the whole thing. You write all these different books, different styles. You have big book on a small subject, small book on a big subject. What is it easier? What's easier or more difficult? It was Paris, France since 1945, where you have to cover a whole sweep for seminar students. I thought that book was fascinating, but what do you like better, and what makes you excited, or they're all?
Well, I like them both, and I like switching back and forth, frankly. I like different kinds of writing and the ability to do different kinds of writing. Right now, for example, I'm working on another textbook, which is a history of modern France, from the French Revolution to the present, from a transnational perspective, and it's called Universal Nation. And that's forced me, one of the things I like about doing this, and it's interesting that both that book, the France in the Second World War, and this book I'm writing when I hold major administrative positions. And I think part of the thing about writing a textbook is, especially when you're not teaching, it's a way of engaging the same level of generality and broad synthesis that I miss from teaching survey courses, because since I'm not teaching survey courses now. A lot of people, when they write textbooks, they simply take their lecture notes from survey courses and then write them up as a textbook. And to a certain extent, I'm doing that, but I'm also putting into that the same energy that I would normally put into my teaching, which I'm not doing now because I'm a dean.
So I was going to ask, talk about the balance of well, or the imbalance. I meant. So not many administrators do write significant books in their field during their administrative time. So you're doing that. How are you balancing all these things and having a life and having a family?
It must say I'm a lousy dean, because I've joked about sneaking out to the you didn't hear that from me. Sneaking out to the library and actually doing stuff. So
yeah, that does seem wrong that a dean would be in a library.
Yeah, well, it's a challenge. I end up spending a lot of time working on stuff late at night and early in the morning, for example. And the other thing is that it's not even just my administrative work or the kind of writing I'm doing. You get to be a full professor. You have to do things like write letters for people's tenure cases, which means reading all their tenure materials, or going to conferences, or reviewing books for publication, stuff like that. And I have to say my approach to that is very bad, because I'll get a request to say write a book review, and they'll say, oh, it's due in 6 months. 6 months, no problem. And then 6 months rolls around. Now, where was that book again? So a certain amount of procrastination and sort of lack of time management, perhaps. But on the other hand, I find that doing this kind of work as a dean, first of all, keeps me in touch with, why I wanted to be in the university in general, and why it's important to fight for the ability of all of us to enjoy this university community, and helps keep me sane.
Well, and I have a sneaking suspicion that universities in general would be better off if deans were sneaking into the library from time to time. And why stop at deans? I can think of other people who should do. So I need you to read just the last, glasses.
Okay, yes.
Starting with Given the Tendency.
Okay.
And I'll just set up. So this is the end of the introduction to Paris Noir.
Okay. Given the tendency of American discussions of race to present blacks as failures or as a, quote, problem, writing a book about black success represents a political statement. Ultimately, Paris Noir is a tale of romance and freedom, of the things that make life worthwhile, and the ability to enjoy them to the fullest. A small group of African Americans discovered this quality in the French capital, and perhaps their greatest accomplishment of all is the vision of complete human liberation that their experience has bequeathed to their brothers and sisters across the sea. Okay. Well, let me comment on that with an anecdote, which was told to me actually by somebody on this campus fairly recently, who lives in the Contra Costa suburbs. And he talked about his daughter at one point. The family at one point had lived in France. It's an African-American family, and they'd spent time in France. Well, actually, I think they had a French exchange student with them and for a year, and then they spent time in France in the summer. And so at the beginning of the school year, the daughter, who was, I think, in high school, was asked to tell the class, everybody was asked to tell us something about their summer vacation. And so she spoke about their time in France. This guy later gets a call from the teacher about why his daughter is making up all these stories about what she's done and making these lies about her experience. The implication being, how could an African American have possibly had this kind of life?
Yeah.
So in other words, there's this image of blacks in the United States as, like I said, basically a social problem. And partly I wrote the book to counteract that.
And you also talk about the story of this. And you do that in several other places in your books. You say, and our story starts here. And I found that interesting because I'm not hip on current what historians write about, but I think of historians as just taking things apart and putting them back together, and that there's not a story. So talk to us about your feeling about stories.
Well, that's why I became a historian. I mean, I always thought of history as just one more story that just in this case happened to be true. When I was really, really little, one of my favorite things was our parents reading to us at night, reading stories. Actually, they had my favorite book was an illustrated version of the Iliad and the Odyssey, of all things, a comic book version of the Iliad and Odyssey, and we loved that. And it was just the idea of a story, and so I think historians should tell stories, and I always look for really compelling ones. One of the ones I found recently is actually, it's in a movie called Joyeux Noël, about the Christmas 1914 truces in World War I. And it's a story about a cat. And it's a cat that was living in the trenches and actually crossed back and forth between the German and French trenches to the point where it was adopted by both sides. It had both a German name and a French name. And it just sort of went back and forth until it was arrested by the French army, put on trial, and executed for high treason. And the filmmaker, in the annex of the film, talks about, well, why, he said, well, people ask me, why did you put this story in the film? And he said, I didn't put it in the film because nobody would ever have believed it. And for me, that's the thing about history. History is stories that are so bizarre that no fiction writer could ever have invented them. And yet there they are.
So in Paris Noir, you talk about all, all artists, everyone, singers, dancers. Well, I was fascinated by how many novelists you mentioned, who I'd never heard of, and you've written the preface to the Stone Face by, right. I can't remember.
William Gardner Smith.
William Gardner Smith. And I want to know if you're ever going to do a reading list of those books, because the way you talk about them, they're all completely fascinating, interesting books about African American life in Paris. And so the answer is yes, you will?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Just want to make sure. How much time do you spend on titles, or is it some of both chapters and the books, or is some of that taken out of your control, or?
That's interesting, because I've often felt the titles were my real bête noire, really difficult thing to deal with. And I can think of articles that, had I thought about it, I would have published them with a much better title or a different title. One of the exceptions to that, I think, is a title that sort of leaped out at me, was this article I wrote called Beyond Dead White Males, Towards a Post-Colonial History of Europe, which I love the title. A lot of my colleagues hated the article. And I think they hated the title particularly, and I think partly because they were identifying with those dead white males. But be that as it may, I liked it.
Well, I asked you because I thought you had great ones. We'll always have Paris.
Yeah, right.
Oh, that's a title, by the way. I'm not just talking privately to him. And you have to be of a certain age, I know.
Yeah, right.
For that. One of them that I really loved was sort of like erecting the boundaries of that foreign country called the past. So, did you work on those, or do they just
Sometimes they come naturally. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's a real struggle.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember one of the best dissertations I ever read was a woman who was working in German history after the Second World War, looking at the integration of Eastern Germany, or East German refugees into Germany. West Germany, and every title in the dissertation was taken from The Wizard of Oz. It was great, Towards the Emerald City, stuff like that. And I thought, God, that's really good. I mean,
And it worked for you.
yeah, yeah.
So if any of my students are here, remember that. I call that the Star Trek theory.
Yeah,
you
right.
bring everything to bear
That's right.
in any paper
That's right.
that you can.
But I mean, part of the whole point of a title is to intrigue the person, to make them interested enough to read the work without sort of giving the impression that you've tricked them into reading something that has nothing to do with the title. You know?
In The Spirit of 1919, each section begins in a slightly different way, but they're really, much more than your other books, really anecdote-driven. And do you work a lot on the beginnings of pieces, of chapters, of books, or is it?
Yeah, I do increasingly, because I mean, I've become more conscious of the fact that that is what's going to grab people or not. So yeah, I try and, have within the first couple of pages, and this is something I've learned from writing lots of articles, you need to get your central idea out there very quickly if you hope to be read at all. I mean, I remember once one of my colleagues was the director of a major French history journal, and he talked about all the submissions he got for articles. And he said, basically, if this person hasn't told me what's the point of this article in the first 3 paragraphs, I don't read any further. So that taught me that, yeah, the beginning is really important. And you see that a lot in academic writing. I mean, my favorite example is the books that'll have like introductions that are like 40 and 50 pages long, and a conclusion that's like 5 pages long, So I think, many of us believe that, the introduction, the beginning is really, really crucial.
That if you don't get it there, you've lost half. Yeah.
You've lost half the readership, yeah.
What do you hate the most about writing? That's sort of like, do you still beat your wife, right? That implies that you have to have something that you hate.
Oh, well, I can tell.
Are there things that you...
Sure,
Let me
there
rephrase
are.
that
I
in
mean,
a more uplifting way.
What I hate the most is after you've written the stuff, you've had all these intellectual, insights and so on and so forth, the production process, you're going through like checking your footnotes to make sure all the citations are proper, to make sure with every book you've got the name and place of publication and the date of publication. But even worse than that is getting permissions for reproducing images, which can really drive you crazy. So you can be told, okay, well, this image that you've seen everywhere, nobody really knows who holds the copyright. So unless you want to take a risk and be sued by somebody that comes out of the woodwork because they happen to read your book, you can't use this image, stuff like that. And so I can remember spending lots of time dealing with that. And of course, that's after all the fun part is over with, right? And yet you know that unless you do that, you're not going to have a book. So you have to do it.
So the fun part, I'm sure there are people here who might argue with the fun part being the writing part. So is writing fun for you? Is it? I sometimes phrase the question as, do you like to write or do you like to have written?
Well, both. I mean, yeah, it's fun to come up with like an idea or turn of phrase that you hadn't really occurred to you until you actually sat down and forced yourself to write it down. There's also times when you look back at something you've written and said, I can't believe I wrote this crap, And what does this mean anyway, But yeah, it is fun. It's something I enjoy. And partly as my life has become full with all sorts of other things I have to deal with, it is a nice space where I'm just there with myself, and I can just sort of focus on one little thing.
I have another 30 questions, but I know we have to let other people have a shot at you. So I want to thank you. And
thank you.
I'd like to turn it over to the audience. And what we will do is because we're being taped, we'll repeat their questions so we don't have to walk around with a microphone. So questions?
Or comments.
Or comments or criticisms.
Yes.
Apparently he's good at all of them.
Well, as a writing teacher and writer, a dozen or so of my students are here, and I'm sure that I've caused them and others, and I quote, sheer torture and agony. I'm wondering if you could describe a little bit more. You said you couldn't identify exactly when it was that writing ceased to be that, but maybe how or why it stopped being that. It strikes me as very often it's the case that it sounds like you may be feeling emotionally and intellectually engaged by what you're observing about what you're writing. Maybe that was the difference.
So the question is,
The question is, how did you get past writing being torture and agony?
how did you get past writing being torture and agony, and can you remember how that changed?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And let me just say one further thing about that. I think that, I mean, it varies for people. For me, I think because I never thought of myself as somebody that was a natural talker, that talked all the time, I never also saw myself as a natural writer. I think a couple things happened. One thing, by the time I reached high school, I began to realize that you could write things and actually say what you thought about something rather than just simply reporting facts. And I can still remember one of the first things I wrote about like that was a movie review when I was in, I think, junior high or high school. And I actually said, well, I didn't like this movie. And I talked about why. And everything I'd been taught until then was, well, you just sort of report what the movie was about, so on and so forth, right? And the idea that you could inject your own ideas and your own personality into it all of a sudden made this more engaging. And the other thing I think was that by the time I hit college, especially my later years in college, I was choosing my own topics and writing about things that were engaging to me and being forced to go out and find facts to support my ideas and arguments. And the idea of making an argument as opposed to simply writing a sort of general description of something became really attractive to me because the idea that you were going to make this statement and defend it. And I thought that was really interesting. So all of a sudden, it stopped being so much torture.
Alex.
Well, Steve asked you about the readers that you have before you publish.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to ask about the readers you have after the books are published. Do you ever get feedback from your readers? And, is it gratifying? Is it stimulating a new idea? What happens after the books are out there in the world?
So sort of two questions. One is, do you ever hear from the people who read your books? And what's it like when the book is out there in the world?
Yeah, exactly. What's that feeling? After you've talked up to the point of publishing, then you can talk past that.
A couple things. One of the things I became aware of, especially after I published Paris Noir, was the whole idea of the author book tour, of you going and speaking to people about your work. And in my case, the press actually organized that, and I spoke to a lot of different groups. And it was really fascinating to see what different things people picked up on. Part of the experience is that you find people that are focusing on areas of your book that you never thought that were not that important to you necessarily, but that struck a chord, and that made me think about different considerations. So for example, one example, when I published Paris Noir, a lot of the questions I got from audiences had to do with, okay, you made this argument about the African Americans saw France as a colorblind country. What about people from other parts of the African diaspora? What about people from the French colonies in Africa or the Caribbean? How did they see the French, and how did they interact with both the French and with these African American expatriates? And that has certainly reframed my own sort of views of the subject. In fact, one of the things I'm working on now is a study of migration from the French Caribbean to France in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as a way of answering that kind of question. You also, of course, this being an online age, from time to time we'll get people writing online, just emailing you about their thoughts about the book, which are mostly positive, otherwise they wouldn't bother to do it, probably. But that's nice too, and then of course, if you get beyond a certain level of sales, there's a whole world of Amazon and all the comments you can get for any book on Amazon, which is, that's a whole nother consideration, because I've known of authors that actually got their friends to write in positive reviews of their books as a marketing device, to inch yourself up beyond 17,000 readers and so on and so forth, right? So that's true as well. But I've enjoyed the times I've had to speak about my work, and I could say I've never really gotten a dumb question about it, because all the questions have been really interesting and have made me stretch my ideas about the work that I've done.
Does that include today?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. Just wanted to check. Oh, time for a couple more, Jane?
Yeah, a question about Paris has such a huge place in people's imagination, popular culture, things we know about writers and artists who have either gone there or came from there and became famous. And I'm sort of wondering, given your subject and your point of view, if you have that in mind while you're writing, or if you sort of are consciously working with that, or if you're sort of more consumed with what you're writing about so that it doesn't interfere or play a role.
So the question is, the larger gestalt of Paris, when you're working on Paris Noir. Does that come into play consciously, do you think, or are you just focused on what we could say is just the the subtitle
Just
of
the
the
facts, ma'am, right? I mean, that's a really good question because I think, yes, it does, although I didn't start out that way. My first book on the Paris suburbs, I mean, if there's one place in France that does not represent the romanticism of France, it is the Paris suburbs. These are really ugly places in many ways, places where no Americans ever go. I mean, I remember when I was doing my research, that people were so fascinated by the idea that an American would actually truck out to the Paris suburbs. The local newspaper wanted to do an article on me, right? Because no Americans ever came there. So it's really the sort of anti-romantic Paris. But certainly with other books, it's an absolute fact that you have to take into account that this is a city that has such a large footprint in the world imagination at this point that not to look at that is sort of to a certain extent to miss the point of why the city is so important. So what I try and do is play with that and try and both express that but also look at ways in which that's problematic.
How do you choose your topics? I mean, given how much time you spend writing a book, it has to be something that you love, and there's so many possibilities. How do you narrow it down?
So how do you choose your topics?
I ask my wife, and she tells me what to write now. I mean, it varies tremendously. When I was my dissertation, I chose because I was very interested in the political left in France, and I was interested to look at where it was strongest, and that led me to the Paris suburbs because the suburb I studied had voted communist for 60 years without a break, and so that was sort of a natural choice. With Paris Noir, like I said, I was looking to do something different. And largely as I began talking to friends and family, I realized how important the idea of the Paris sojourn was to so many different people. It seemed like everybody I talked to had some aunt who'd lived in Paris or some friend who'd spent time there or knew somebody who knew somebody, so on and so forth. And it seemed to me that this is not just an interesting story, but a fundamental part of the African-American experience that hadn't been really told synthetically. And then Paris 1919, came out of a number of different respects. And I should say, by the way, Paris 1919 is an interesting book because I actually started that before I started Paris Noir. I started that shortly after I left graduate school, after I finished my dissertation, and then just let it sit for over a decade while I worked on Paris Noir and other things, and then came back to it. And so in some ways, it's the most unusual of my books because it spans such a long period of time and has taken advantage of different changes in historiography that occurred during the intervening time. But I was interested in, again, this whole issue of consumer politics that had largely surfaced during my first book, and also interested in issues of war and peace. I mean, one of the nice things about 1919 is that it's a year split almost exactly between war and peace, because the peace treaty was signed on June 28th. So it embodies little bits of both, and in many ways sets the tone for the 20th century as a whole. So, and then there's other ideas of books that somehow just won't leave you alone, that you end up continually thinking about. So, which is why I'm writing this textbook, for example. So yeah, there's no one answer, but different things that happen.
Well, I really love what you say, though, about some things won't leave you alone. I think that's sort of a nice thing to think about, that you just have to get it out of your system.
Right,
That, yeah,
right.
yeah. I think we have time for one more.
So I want to ask you about evidence in your writing process. Some people have the technique that they write something without looking at any of the evidence, and then they plug in the thing to make sure they weren't lying. And other people just line up the pieces of evidence and string them together. What's your technique?
Both. No, I mean, it's hard to answer that, and it's a really good question, but I think more the latter than the former, frankly. That I tend to, it depends on the book, but I tend to start off with a basic idea, and then I'm looking for a whole, string of documents, of facts, of ideas that support that. But I don't just sort of go into a situation where I've got all this stuff and then I'm going to plug it into, then I'm just to see what it adds up to. One of the things I've noticed in my writing is that I'll often start up with an idea and then find out that the evidence completely contradicts that idea, and then I have to shift. So for example, in my dissertation, I was based in a sort of historiographical tradition that looked at political militants as being tied to the workplace, being tied to factories, so on and so forth. And so I settled on the suburb only to find out that the suburb had no factories, it had no workplaces, and yet it was voting heavily communist. So that forced me to fundamentally rethink my approach. And so that I developed this whole idea about consumer politics, right? But I didn't go into it with that idea. And yet I had to be aware of, I mean, you know, what I was working on and what I had inherited from reading other historians to explain this phenomenon wasn't working. It just didn't explain it. So I had to come up with something else. And I could have done two things. I could have done what I did, developed another idea, or I could have shifted to another place that did correspond more to the sort of received narrative, which I think would have been a mistake in some ways.
But then we read about so many best-selling popular historians who would have just proceeded,
Right.
right? Well, this doesn't quite match the facts, but it's going to make a wonderful book.
Yeah,
Right?
that's right. That's right.
I can't thank you enough. This has been wonderful and revealing. Thank you so much.